Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're going to talk about historical accuracy in fiction. So recently in the world of pop culture, we had one of those fake issues. A controversy within the world of video games that wasn't really a true controversy so much as a bunch of angry people on the internet trying to kick up a storm. Mainly it has to do with the latest iteration of Battlefield, where it's been announced that in World War II you'll be able to play as both male and female characters. Like I said, it's kind of kicked up a non-real hornet's nest. Most people out there haven't even heard about this issue, let alone care enough to have an opinion one way or another. There are some people who are outright upset though, saying that the game is not historically accurate and it's lacking in some way because of it. And as much as I don't like to give way to the internet culture of controversies and that stuff, and have been trying to avoid that sort of thing lately, this is an interesting issue that we can talk about outside of this one silly little controversy, and it's interesting enough to talk about within the context of comic books that I thought I'd bring it up here. The debate over the Battlefield game itself is one that I think actually does have some merit in a couple of directions. Because Battlefield, unlike other shooter franchises and just other video games, has always placed a pretty strong emphasis on realism. So, if we're looking back at World War II, well, no, not a lot of women were combatants, but it did exist across the large theater of war during World War II, which covered a great deal of conflicts in various nations, some of which did have women in combat, but to say that this was a widespread phenomenon back then is not entirely true. But it is kind of true, at least in the spirit of things. Women entered the workforce in a big way, and World War II in a lot of ways was a lot of progress for women's rights. They were able to work in stuff like factories and stuff while the men went off to war, is at least the traditional view. And as such, women were involved in this conflict in a big way that they weren't necessarily in past wars before this. And when we're talking about realism in Battlefield, usually it's in the context of machinery, weaponry, and vehicles, which are depicted in usually a very realistic manner that behave and sound like the weapons they're supposed to depict. If that's the case, well then it really doesn't matter at all, especially in a first-person shooter where whatever character you're playing as is barely going to be visible most of the time, and your opponents are all going to be heavily armored and moving very quickly. Look, I've played online multiplayer shooters like this. You don't exactly have time to get a good look at your opponent before knocking them out as quickly as possible. The closest thing to that not being true is a sniper, and usually once I spot a target, have locked it down and have managed to line it up in the hopes of getting a headshot or something, I have maybe had a decent look at whatever pixelated camo they're wearing, but that doesn't mean anything. So when it comes to something like this, when it's just a matter of simple character creation in a video game, well, historical accuracy doesn't really matter much at all. But when we look at the scope of fiction as a whole, does it matter? Can it matter? Well, of course, sometimes it does. When we look at the Assassin's Creed franchise, a huge feature of that is going back in time and playing out the life of someone in a specific time period. So naturally, to a degree, historical accuracy should matter. In Origins, you were running around ancient Egypt, so it'd be really weird if a train showed up in the middle of nowhere, like it did in the London version of the Assassin's Creed game. So obviously it depends on the time period we're looking at and the context of the game. When we look at a story like, say, Captain America or Wonder Woman, these don't have to be as historically accurate even when they take place in another time period, because these are lofty comic book stories. We know Captain America didn't really exist during World War II, but it's fun to explore what someone like that might have done during that time period, regardless of what actually happened in that time period. It's why, to be honest, they could probably even go farther than they actually do in a lot of Captain America stories when we flash back to this time period. I could see Steve Rogers confronting Hitler or something like that, and even the real-world person being defeated and killed in a way different to the way that he actually died in real history. Because we know enough about those real events for them to play around with it and it not to be as big a deal. On the other hand, sometimes the context of what you're changing matters too. Captain America can play around with stuff like the events of Normandy and the general war during World War II once America had joined that battle as much as they like, and no one's really going to be that offended. But if they start tinkering around with what happened during the Holocaust, or what happened on the Eastern Front during the Japanese occupation of China, well, people are going to be rightfully upset about that, because then you're blanketing over the reality of history and what happened during that time period. So as is so often the case with issues like this, it really comes down to the context of what changes are being made. Obviously, if we get into nonfiction stories and comic books, the historical accuracy of those is paramount. On the other hand, when we get into fictional comics and stories, it really depends on the type of story and characters that you're using to tell that story. Secret Path, a graphic novel by Jeff Lemire that depicts life in an Indian residential school, which is a stain on Canadians' history that we live with it to this day, then historical accuracy matters a lot, even though the story is fictional. Because you're telling a very tragic event that happened to real people, and you need to do that story justice. To that end, it's important to know a lot about history and to understand the events you're depicting. Sometimes historical accuracy can also inform your story to a great extent. The Vavitch relied heavily on realistic takes on dialogue from that time period, and often used a lot of the aesthetics and the dour tone of that time period to inform its creepy Salem-style story. Game of Thrones uses a lot of real-world history to its own advantage, but transposes it onto a fictional world. But George R.R. Martin is smart enough to make changes and to amp things up, which is good to do in a bombastic fantasy epic like his. Or we can look at another HBO series like Westworld, where historical inaccuracy is actually used to the story's advantage. The Old West is a bit of a mythology to begin with, but the version that Westworld depicts, the lofty iteration that is largely inspired by Western film that conveniently ignores a lot of the realities of that actual time period, is perfect because Westworld doesn't depict the Old West. It depicts a theme park depicting the Old West, and that's a very critical difference. I didn't love season 2, by the way. And if it sounds like I'm rattling off a lot of examples, it's just to show the sheer breadth that historical accuracy can take across fiction. It's to show that the people making arguments on the more, we'll just say, bigoted side of the fence in this Battlefield controversy really aren't speaking to the full depth that historical accuracy can have. If Battlefield, say, wants to have a very realistic take, except they give you a lot more options than what would necessarily be true for that time period, well then who cares? Let people be whatever color and gender they want. It doesn't affect the actual gameplay, and it probably won't affect the actual story. Meanwhile, something like BioShock Infinite very much involved you playing as a white, older man. And that matters. That was for a very good reason that specifically had to do with the story in question. And if you were any other demographic, it wouldn't necessarily work the same, and the game itself would have to be written differently, which ultimately would be at the disservice to that plot and the misdirection going on within that game. Meanwhile, when history is referenced in a story, it really is important that the writer gets that correct. Here's an example of that in action. In Marvel's Civil War, the original comic, not the movie or the sequel, the story is bookended by tales of Rome during its fall. It provides framing to the fictional event taking place in the present, meaning that looking back on that story in a historically accurate way is very important. This is why it's also important to represent history when we're referring back to events such as in Black Panther when they're looking back at colonial history throughout the entire continent of Africa. On the other hand, if Captain America or Wonder Woman are flashing back to events in the long distant past, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because, like I said, the flexibility is there so long as the changes they're making are innocuous and not that big a deal. Does Wonder Woman get away with some things in World War I that she might not have in reality? Possibly, but who really cares? It's not like it's doing a disservice to the real events of World War I back then, nor should anyone be looking into the events of that movie as a realistic depiction of those events. Likewise, in her sequel, which is going to be looking back at 1984, it doesn't have to be fully historically accurate, even though there's plenty of people around who lived that time period, as long as the general spirit and identity of that time period is intact. A good example of that in action in another movie would be Titanic, where it might not be fully historically accurate, but it sure went a long way to be quite accurate in terms of the ship's real size and scale relative to the average person, and in terms of having the passengers be more or less real people, even if the way they were depicted in the movie wasn't true to their real-world selves. They were dramatized, and if anything, the production crew had to apologize to some families because of how villainous and insane they made some of the characters out to be in the movie. That wasn't true about how the real world people were, but James Cameron correctly understood that you needed to tell a story and you needed to sort of amp things up, especially in a story kind of as grand and simplistic as the Titanic. Now, if it sounds like I'm not really coming up with a firm conclusion here, it's because you can't, outside of the conclusion that it really depends on the story and the content you're looking at. If it's not an important change to history that's being made, then a story can be historically inaccurate, so long as everyone kind of understands what's going on here. In an extreme example of that, Inglourious Basterds went all out and had a laughably historically inaccurate ending, but that's okay given the context of what they were saying with that story. On the other hand, if you go too far with this and you start whitewashing history, then people are going to be rightfully upset. There's a lot of time-traveling shows that are guilty of this, for example. There's a goofy one made by Eric Kripke that tends to whitewash a lot of history, and as much as I like Legends of Tomorrow, this show is guilty of sometimes overlooking some of the civil rights issues that plague history in favor of telling a goofy adventure story. It's hard to fully blame Legends of Tomorrow for wanting to do that, but sometimes they really should just leave certain time periods well enough alone for that very reason. But just because something is a little problematic doesn't mean it's unacceptable. Legends of Tomorrow on the whole is a good show that actually does justice to a lot of these time periods. Last season, they actually did a great job with a lot of this stuff, including one of my favorite episodes they've done to date, which featured Elvis and did the man justice and gave a full picture of the kind of person he is, both the good and the bad. It was actually very nice and a very sincere story overall. So let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. What are some examples of historical accuracy you think are good or bad? I'm very curious because, like I said, in spite of this being kind of a BS story that we started with, it's a discussion worth having, and it's interesting looking at different stories and how well they do at depicting history. I've actually taken courses on university in this. Very cool courses our history department offered that dealt with the various nature of how well certain movies and film depicted historical events. It's quite something looking at how well some of them do and how bad some are, especially when they purport to be historical. So thanks for watching. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page. This was actually a Patreon-based request. I put up a few ideas for a vlog, and I was surprised this one won, but I'm kind of glad. It was an interesting opportunity to talk about this, and I really wasn't sure whether or not you guys would be interested. So Patreon's a good way of letting me know that, and you can do so for only $1 a month. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.